Welcome to the Trigger Warning Talk podcast, where we have uncensored conversations. We exchange information and we provide a ton of resources for all the listeners. We are streaming on all the major podcast platforms, and you can also watch these interviews on Spotify, the free version, as well as our YouTube channel, which is Pending Consulting Solutions LLC. I'm your Fire Medic CEO host, LP. I have a very special guest in the building today. We're going to be having a great conversation, and let me give you some of the disclaimers first before I give her glorious introduction, because I'm so honored to have her in the Trigger Warning Talk podcast. So if you're triggered at any time during this podcast and you need help immediately, and I mean like immediately, please call 911. It's going to get you all the mandated reporters and the help that you need. It starts all the documentation process. If you don't have an immediate need, but you still need help with either substance abuse issues, we provide the numbers and websites to AA, NA, and Al-Anon. If you are suicidal or know of a suicidal situation, you need help 24/7 or toll free, you can call 988 here in the United States. And finally, we provide the numbers and websites in the show notes for every episode for domestic violence, sexual-based offenses, and trafficking. And we also cover true crime cases. At the end of every interview, including this one, we always cover a missing persons case. And those cases, primarily 99% of them, do cover melanated folks, because we want to bring the same media attention and energy to those that we don't see typically in mainstream media. We have a case today that we're going to be talking about from a young man who is missing from the East Coast, from Delaware. He's been missing since 2009, folks, and they don't have a whole bunch of information, but I thought I'd bring his case to the forefront because it's a very interesting case. And of course, Mrs. LP, being the true crime detective that she is, she's going to be talking about that case very soon. And so what we want to do is bring on the screen here, we're going to be talking about this young man. His name is Adrian Anderson. Miss Meg O'Rourke. She is a registered dietitian. She is someone who I met in this app called Clubhouse. And in Clubhouse, I moderate with Aaron Ryland and our collaborator, Leah Abraham, a room called Eating Disorders and Disordered Eating, or they call it houses now, but that's a whole nother conversation. And in that room, we talk about everything related to eating disorders and disordered eating. Meg, being a registered dietitian, is so apropos because we know that eating disorders and disordered eating typically has a medical and a mental health component to it. And so I want to bring Meg up and have her introduce herself. And we're just going to jump right into it because I am so fascinated by the work that Meg does. And I'm so honored to have you here in the Trigger Warning Talk podcast. What's going on with you, my friend?
Hi, LP. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be here.
You know, Meg, give us a little bit of your background, because I like hearing people talk about themselves. I always tell my guests, this is my podcast, but it's your interview. And you're going to be doing the majority of the talking. It's not about me. You know, I could have done a soliloquy-based podcast, but I didn't want to do that. Tell us about Meg and how you became this extraordinary, popular, and sought-after registered dietitian.
Yeah, so I started, around when I was 12 years old, actually. I actually read an article in a magazine by a registered dietitian, and I didn't know what that was. So at that time, around 12 years old, I started researching what is a registered dietitian, and I learned that it's, it's kind of comparable to any, other healthcare worker, whether it's a registered nurse, a doctor, a social worker. We're all, kind of part of the team, especially when you're talking about eating disorders. So from there, I started researching, and actually my father didn't want me to be a dietitian. He's like, you should be a nurse. And I was like, no, that's not what, I don't like blood.
Sound like my mom. She didn't want to, she went to nursing school and she stopped because when it came to the clinical, she was like, blood, guts. Nope, I'm out.
I get it. So nutrition was perfect for me, and I was already interested in it anyway. And my father was always, into exercising. He coached. He did a lot of coaching. He was the athletic director of the town. And he did, he actually trained or worked with Bill Rogers, who's won the Boston Marathon 3 or 4 times. I can't even remember now. He was on his cross-country team. So that's how I got started, and then I just went to undergraduate and then graduate school at UCONN, and I started working in right away. My first job was an oncology dietitian, where I worked with people that had cancer,
Okay.
and my first 5 years was mainly in oncology, and then after that, I went to another hospital. I worked in a level 3 trauma unit, ICU, where the doctors turned to me for the recommendations for TPN, and that's when you're getting nutrition through the vein, because you're intubated where you can't eat or take fluids or any of that kind of stuff. And then, I just did a myriad of other things. I taught cardiac classes to people who just had heart attacks or some kind of heart disease like CHF, congestive heart failure, which I know you're very familiar with, LP.
Oh yeah.
And then in 2008, I was a manager. I was a higher end manager for a bigger healthcare company for about a year. I put like 67,000 miles on my car, and I said, I cannot do this anymore. I don't want to do it. I don't care how much they pay me. It's not worth it. And I decided to start my own business in 2008. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. And I did work with eating disorders for about 5 years. No, probably longer, almost 10. I'd say about 8 years I worked in eating disorders. And right now I'm still very aware of eating disorders, and I kind of keep myself in the loop. I could take continuing education on eating disorders sometimes still, but my main practice is for like weight loss resistance, chronic GI issues, and I would say test, don't guess. There's testing that you can do to determine based on your genomes. Nutrigenomics is going to be a huge thing in the future. It already is pretty big. We're using your genes to determine what foods you should or should not be eating. And it's not just, nutrigenomics. It's a lot of different areas where the technology is just, crazy. Like I recently went to the dentist, and they said this technology that they were using, they told me you could see a cavity before it starts now. And I was like, wow.
Yeah. I am so interested in this interview because a lot of people are like, okay, I thought you guys talk about traumas. And it's like, yeah, we talk about traumas, and we're going to talk about that right now, because eating disorders and disordered eating, a lot of people that I've encountered in EMS, as well as my post-EMS career, because I'm not working on an ambulance or a fire truck anymore since I retired in 2020 during the pandemic. I've had patients who I found, not from them telling me, from my own assessment when I came on scene, because the 911 call came out as a dry heave or it came out as a suicide attempt. Through my assessment, I found out that these two young ladies had an eating disorder, and they developed this eating disorder because both of them had been raped, and because of their rape, they found out that, they had this body dysmorphia. And part of that was because one of the young ladies said that the guy that raped her, the one that did the suicide attempt, he kept making reference to her voluptuousness during this rape. And so she said after that happened, she wanted to do everything. She wanted to be 180 degrees different in terms of her body type. So she gained all this weight. She didn't like that, and she started becoming bulimic. The other young lady who was suicidal, what she did was she took all these pills, and she took some substance, and she never told us what it was. But the source of her trauma began when she was raped also as a young girl, and she just had so many issues with sexual traumas throughout her life, and she was just 21, and so she became anorexic. Because again, her body type was something that guys made reference to all the time, whatever, and that's what they said attracted them to her. And those guys end up doing these sexual assaults against her. And so she changed her body type. She wanted to be not attractive and all these things. And so I wanted to talk to you as a registered dietitian, because I can imagine if I am encountering these folks, when I transport them to the hospital, which both of them did get transported to the hospital, I'm only there for the pre-hospital environmental. You are part of the hospital care.
Mm-hmm.
The one that they may meet before they get discharged. They absolutely will encounter you either in private practice, or they will encounter you as a referral from the case manager to help them with these eating disorders and disordered eating. But I want to talk to you specifically about your experience with women and men, or we'll just say all genders, because when it comes to trauma, I would say anybody can get it, anybody can give it. Can you tell us about your experience with those individuals who have been traumatized by sexual-based offenses, domestic violence, and maybe even trafficking, that develop eating disorders that you've been referred to?
Yeah, and like I said, back in about 2000, I would say about 2008 to about 2018, somewhere around there, I was mainly seeing people with eating disorders in my private practice. I also worked at a facility that was for eating disorders only, really. And so, yeah, it just doesn't, you just don't wake up one day and have an eating disorder. It's usually something that builds upon some kind of trauma or some kind of something that happened to you. It could be a comment. It could be something a doctor says to you. It could be so many different stories I've heard over the years. I mean, that's why I always tell fathers to really be careful what you're saying to your daughters about their weight, their body. Because I remember one lady in particular who was older, probably in her 50s, but she had an eating disorder her whole life. She would remain between, I'd say, between 85 and 95 pounds her entire life. And I don't think she ever got over the eating disorder entirely. But she said she was playing jump rope one day in the yard, and her father made a comment. And it wasn't a very nice comment. And so that triggered her, and she never got over it. Now, was there other things under? Of course. But sometimes that one thing can start someone off and just trigger it. So personally, my opinion is, don't say anything to anybody about their body, like, unless it's, positive. So for example, some people that are thin, people walk up to them like it's okay to do and say, "You're so skinny, you're so thin." And it's really kind of a backwards compliment, if it is a compliment at all, because that person doesn't like being thin. So why people feel the need to comment on people's bodies is beyond me. And I just would like to say, as a subtle reminder, that I don't think making a comment about somebody's body is appropriate. If you want to say, that looks good on you, or that's a pretty dress, but, oh, you look so thin, in that, probably isn't the right comment, because we don't know where that person has been, it just like you wouldn't say to someone, "Oh my God, you're so overweight or obese." It's the same thing. We really should be commenting. It's the flip side of the coin.
I'm so glad that you say that, because I'm a dad, and my middle daughter, she just turned 18 in April, and she just graduated high school.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a party for her. She didn't want a big hoopla and all that stuff. So we had a little party for her at the house with some family and friends yesterday. And so she made a comment to me about her body parts, and it just kind of came out of the open, and I was like, "Okay, hold on, let me have a seat real quick." She wanted to tell me about something, and I was like, "Let me have a seat real quick." And everybody started laughing. It was her mom and two of her girlfriends that are her roommate. I was like, "Look, I'm just saying, I'm far be it from me to be the caveman, knuckle dragging Neanderthal dinosaur. I need a moment, Richard. So let me just have a seat, because I don't know what you're getting ready to tell me." And then when she said it, I was like, "Oh, okay, that's cool. I got it. I can deal with it." But men have to be cognizant of those things, because men typically say things without thought a lot of times. Hey, if I go up to you, whether I know you or not, and make a comment about how you look, I don't know how you're going to take that. A lot of times when I talk to guys all the time about men's mental health also. And we talk about these issues, and I say, if you go up to a woman, wherever you meet her, you shoot your shot, basically. And on this podcast, we have uncensored conversations. So if you got to have some adult language, that's okay. So one of the things I say to guys is, when you shoot your shot and it goes to shit, you can't be mad because of her response to it.
Mm-hmm.
Comment about, you're so beautiful, I would love to be able to, take you out to dinner one day or out for a drink, and she tells you no, you don't know why her answer is no, but it don't matter because no means no, right guys? No means no. Can I hear from the nosebleed seats? I'm trying and I'm striving to teach guys about boundaries, and that's why we entitled this episode Harmony with Boundaries. I want you to talk about, and it's a play on your harmony with food.
Yep.
So we'll talk about your website, which is harmonywithfood.com, towards the end. Let's talk about these boundaries, because as a registered dietitian who deals with clients who have been traumatized primarily, and the results of their trauma is dealing with eating disorders and disordered eating, what are some of give me the top 5 things that you have heard from clients that say, I've been traumatized? What are some of those things that they say specifically about their trauma as it relates to sexual offenses, domestic violence, or even trafficking?
One really sticks out to me. It was a really, really bad case. Someone who ran all spectrums, like the lady, the girl woman you just spoke about, where she was too thin for a long time, and then she got obese, and she was abused by family members, not just her father, but uncles too. And one of the things she said to me was that she told her mother, and her mother said, just be a good girl and do what they say. And a lot of times it's parents that are, alcoholics. Her mother was an alcoholic. So she was totally not in the picture to protect her own daughter. She just wasn't available and eventually left. So this person had no one to tell. And was very, very traumatized, disassociation, and all of that later in her life. So I would say alcoholism can play a role, as again in many disorders, I'm sure, because it is obviously to grow up in a household where your mother or father is not sober is very scary for kids, and a lot of times they have to control something, so they're either like controlling their neatness or controlling their food, or they have to control something because everything else is out of control. So I would say, sexual abuse, alcoholism, sometimes it could just be family dynamics. It could even be abuse among siblings. And then what would be another one? Oh, yeah, sports. Sports is a huge one. Not that sports are bad, but as I get older, I'm starting to realize that sports are good to a point. When a person decides that they're going to try and make it big in the sports field, sometimes that can be super traumatic too, because A, it's disappointment, a lot of disappointment, and B, how healthy are you going to be? How, there is something called orthorexia, which is, being too healthy, right? Like exercising all the time, eating to the point where you're afraid to eat anything that wouldn't be, organic and 100% this and that, that's an issue. So lots of different reasons for people developing eating disorders. But the main thing, I think the big takeaway is that a lot of people don't realize it's not really about food. It's about the trauma or the abuse or what happened to them to bring them to this point in their life where they have this body dysmorphia, which for some people may not know what that means. And basically it's you look in the mirror and you see something different than what is actually there. You may see yourself heavier, you may see yourself curvier than you are, or, probably the opposite too. Sometimes people are overweight and they see themselves thinner than they are, and they don't realize how heavy they are till they see a picture. I've heard many people tell me that it wasn't until they saw a picture, and that happens both sides of the coin again, right? Obesity and too thin, anorexia. So I would say those are some of the top things that I've seen in my practice.
My wife is a huge fan, Mrs. LP. She's a huge fan of the artist Lizzo.
Yeah.
And Mrs. LP and her BFF, since she was in kindergarten, I believe, went to see Lizzo in concert here in Charlotte a few months ago.
Oh, cool.
And I remember they were live streaming from the concert and different things like that. And I remember thinking, when I was listening to some of the stories that she talked about how Lizzo talked about her weight, how, she gets all this flack from critics saying that she should be more mindful of some of the things that she does, because there are times when she's in public, on stage or what have you, and she'll pull down her bottoms, whatever she's wearing, and show her butt. Or I know there was one time she was at a Lakers game and she had on a really revealing, quote unquote, outfit that she got a lot of criticism about. And sometimes I say to people, would you say the same thing if there was a Beyonce with that same outfit, or Kardashian, or some other celebrity? Would you have those same comments? I know KeKe Palmer, the actress, she just got into a tiff on social media with her boyfriend. She just became a mom, and she was at a concert with Usher, and she had on this black outfit, but it was sheer on some parts. And her boyfriend made this comment on social media about her, because she's a mom now, she shouldn't be wearing type of stuff like that or whatever. And again, it's these comments that sometimes people make, and I'm going to say especially men, when it comes to the lack of sensitivity on how that may affect that other person. That doesn't mean that you don't have a right to your opinion. I say be mindful of the opinion that you give. You can give an honest opinion with sensitivity, and you have to learn how to have conversations without confrontation, or maybe even creating controversy. For you, Meg, I want to know specifically about the boundaries that you instill in these clients who have been sexually offended, who are survivors of domestic violence, who have developed eating disorders and disordered eating, because I'm sure that has to be a component of your private practice that you consult with these survivors on. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so you really do have to have boundaries, because if you're not having boundaries, that's not healthy for you or the patient. So, also, just making sure that you're staying within your, because it's easy to, I'll just do this once for this person. Well, this once can have you lose your license. So if you are breaking the ethical criteria that we have to follow as registered dietitians, or any healthcare professional, licensed healthcare professional or person, that there has to be boundaries, and boundaries are good. Yes. And they're going to help you as a professional stay professional. So for example, you can't just send them a card, because that is breaking the boundaries. Although it sounds like a nice thing to do, take that card and what you write in that card and twist it and turn it and take it the wrong way. So you have to remain professional and have professional boundaries, because if you don't, it's not healthy for the patient. It's not really going to help the patient. If you start being more like friendly than professional with them, it can actually harm them. And then if you do it for one, who's to say you're not going to do it for more than one? So putting up professional boundaries right away. And honestly, I learned about this in undergrad. It wasn't like something I learned, when I opened my private practice. I took an ethics class in college, and they taught, and it was mostly nurses, some dietitians in the room, and healthcare professionals, and it was all about boundaries. And if you break those boundaries, you're risking your license. So that's a big, big, big deal. And then, of course, there's HIPAA laws in place just because of that. I remember in let's say late 90s, maybe 2000, somewhere around there, actually being in elevators in the hospital, and people were talking about patients. And it wasn't until they really set the HIPAA laws into place and made it very clear. It was later. It definitely wasn't in place when I was younger. I know that. But eventually, it's part of, you getting into, like, say you get a job at a hospital. In that orientation, they're going to talk to you about boundaries. So throughout my career, I've been gently reminded. Every year I have to take an ethics course, at least one credit, let's say, within a 5-year period. But, I probably take about one a year, just those gentle reminders to reinforce that the boundaries are so important, not just for you as a professional to say, not lose your license, right? That's a big deal. That's your livelihood, but also to remind you that those boundaries are in place for a reason. So, for instance, let me give you an example. I have my business phone that I have somebody answering for me. Not one of my patients has my cell phone number. Why? Because that would be breaking, in my opinion, breaking the boundaries. Now, do I know social workers and stuff that work with eating disorders, that their patients know their phone number? I do, and I don't think that in itself is breaking a boundary. No, because that's how they make appointments and stuff. They don't have an assistant. Sure. For me, it just felt best to have someone else answering the phone, because it would be so easy for that patient to text me at any time of the day, night or day. And honestly, I'm not available 24/7 to all my patients when I was doing eating disorders, because you can't be, because that would be breaking some boundaries. They need to call 911 or their social worker or their doctor if they're having a problem. So that's just an example of something that I've done that I feel like has helped a lot for myself and for the patients.
Survivors of DV and or intimate partner violence specific. When you encounter these individuals who come to you that have survived domestic violence and they developed an eating disorder, or they have disordered eating, let's say a man who became obese because of his ancestral and generational trauma that started from his home. I know some guys specifically who became obese because of ancestral and generational trauma from home. How do you deal with those particular issues as a registered dietitian? Because it's not just about, okay, well, we're going to come up with a meal plan for you.
Yes.
Here's my template charts that I have. I'm sure you don't have one that says obesity male meal plan only. Mm-hmm. How do you approach a patient in that situation who's been let's say again, a person who identifies as a male specifically, who is obese and has an eating disorder, who's been victimized by DV? What say you to that individual patient?
Yeah, you always have to, the way I do things is you start where they are at, and you have to see where they are at right at that point in time. And the goal may be different. The end goal may be different, and it may change. But sometimes we just have to focus on, okay, where are they at and where are we going? And, there's people that have, say, bulimia that are going to fast food, 4 times a day, buying a lot of fast food. And by the way, that's just as addictive as a drug.
Absolutely.
So food can be super, super addictive. And when you start adding up how much they're spending, sometimes you might look at someone who spends, I don't know, what are cigarettes, $12 a pack, now $10 a pack. And you might say,
probably so, yeah.
You might say, wow, that's a lot of money. Like, look what you're spending. But then there's people that are going to fast food, spending $40, $50, maybe even $80 a day on food just because they have bulimia. Can really, really, really add up. And so now it's, it's getting to be another problem in addition to the bulimia. Right now you have a financial problem because the addiction overtakes the person, like with drugs or alcohol or whatever. Any addiction, right? Whether it be gambling, shopping too much, whatever it could be. When you start thinking about something 90% of the day or more, or you could probably even say 75%, but I think the psychiatrist will say when you're thinking about things 90% of the day, that's like what you're going to eat, when you're going to eat, when you're going to, throw up, like all these things. You can't really focus on your life anymore, and it just becomes overwhelming, right? And that's how the food can be addictive. So I just think that we need to think about, okay, like eating disorders are real. And and I think a lot of people still don't talk about it. I don't think it's talked about as much as it should be, but I will tell you it's way more prominent than you think. I'm not going to spew off any statistics because, again, I'm not really working in eating disorders right now, so I don't have those statistics to spew off. But I would say that just be aware, of, again, reminder, like what you say to people, how they're going to interpret that. You don't know where they are, where they've been, what they've done, what they've experienced. So, again, just another gentle reminder to, be careful about those comments that you make.
I'm sure in your practice, I always say that when I was active in the field, my patient was not just a person who was hurt, injured, dying, or dead. My patient included that individual. It included the caregivers that were on scene, the family, the friends, the bystanders, the other first. When I showed up on scene with my partner, and if we had other EMS or other first responders, me being the lead medic, my responsibility was everybody on that scene, whether it was one person or 1,000 people, because anybody that ended up being hurt, injured, dying, or dead from that one individual, whether it was a medical or mental health issue or what have you, that person was my patient too. And if I had to call in other resources, that was my responsibility as the mandated reporter, as the licensed and certified professional for you. How do you deal with caregivers or partners who may even be the source of that trauma that caused your patient to have and develop this eating disorder and disordered eating, specifically in a DV or sexual-based offense? How do you deal with those individuals in terms of teaching your patient about boundaries? I know you're not a mental health professional per se. However, I'm sure that's part of the conversation.
Yeah. A lot of times what with this question, the first thing I keep thinking of is fathers. Fathers are like, okay, you just got to eat. You just got to eat. They do not get it sometimes when someone has an eating disorder. So a lot of times, well, all the time, when you're working with someone with an eating disorder, it is a team approach from starting with you, who is going to the house a lot of times for dehydration or dry heaves or whatever it may be. Right. Your report, I will see your report when I'm in the hospital, or right. Records come over. So I'll see your report. I'll talk to the social worker. I'll talk to the psychiatrist, and we'll talk to the doctor. And the hospital, unfortunately, isn't the greatest place for eating disorders. A lot of times they will go there, get immediate treatment, and then be released and sent to an outpatient professional place for eating disorders. That's in the person.
I want you to hold on right there. I want to say something. I want to add to that. Here's something that I want to, and I apologize for interrupting.
No, okay.
I want to say, and I'm glad that you said that, the ED, or the emergency department as we call it, that's the technical term, or we'll say ER for everybody. The ER is their main goal is to stabilize people that are hurt, injured, dying, or dead. If you want to look up what the emergency room does or department does, that's their bottom line. And next, so people go there and they treat the ER like it's their primary care facility. It's not. It can help you be stabilized in the event of an emergency, and it can link you with resources like a Meg who is a registered dietitian here on the Trigger Warning Talk podcast. I want you to go ahead and continue, but that's a very important point that I wanted to highlight that you made, because a lot of times we get it confused. So what happened?
I think another reminder of that is too, and I don't know if it was you or someone else. Someone called into my show one day that was an emergency person like you, and he said, you know, people think if they call, and you said this before too, I think if they call, 911 and an ambulance comes, they're going to get right into a bed.
Right. I said that, in a clubhouse.
No, yes, that's not the way it works. He said that it was, don't think that, because it's not true. And sometimes I believe, you may have to pay for that ambulance call if your insurance doesn't cover it, or if you're using the system. I would think that there'd be some boundaries there. As far as, abusing the system and calling too much, or people call because they're lonely or things like that. Like, that's not what it's for. So we need to be aware of the fact that there are places that that are appropriate for people with eating disorders. But the ER is great to get people stable, like you said, but it's not going to be the place where you're really going to get long-term help. And most people that have eating disorders, all people that have eating disorders, in my opinion, need a team. And that's the social worker, the dietitian, the psychiatrist, the doctor, maybe case manager, all of that. The team gets together and talks about each one of the cases every week. Or there should be some communication. Like for me, it might not have been a team meeting because I had a private practice, the social worker had a private practice, the psychiatrist, but it would be a phone call, a voicemail, a message, a private message to say what happened in the meeting. Or we would be sharing each other's notes. That's super important too. So it really is a team approach. Whenever somebody has an eating disorder, the ER can help stabilize, but it's not going to be the place that's going to fix your problem long term.
We got a few more minutes remaining, and I got a few more questions. I'm not going to give you the 27 parts to my question that I normally ask, because Mrs. LP doesn't like that. So she said, can you condense that down? So I got a few more questions.
Okay.
The work that you do in private practice, how much do you work hand in hand with mental health professionals for your clients who are dealing with eating disorders and disordered eating, who have been traumatized by DV or trafficking or sexual traumas? How much do you work with these individuals hand in hand?
Yeah, it's a no-brainer that you have to be working with a social worker. It has to be a team. I can't emphasize that enough. Can't just be the dietitian. And as a matter of fact, if someone is seeing me and they didn't tell me they had an eating disorder, and this does happen a lot, they just come in for X, Y, or Z. They could be normal weight. And I want people to remember this and hear this, and I'll probably repeat it. You can be totally normal weight and be bulimic.
Okay.
You can be totally normal weight. You can even be overweight and have bulimia. So that it's a whole reason behind that, which I won't go into now. But people need to be aware that just because someone's a normal weight, a lot of times normal weight people come in and then not the first session, not the second session, maybe the 10th session, when they're feeling more comfortable, they tell me they actually are making themselves throw up, or binging and purging, or just binging, or they could be exercise bulimia, right, where they eat a lot of calories every day, but they're exercising to burn it off hours upon hours upon hours a day. That's another type of bulimia, is exercise bulimia. So just realize that it is not even a choice. You have to work with the psychiatrist, the social worker, the doctor, because it's a team effort to get that person to where they need to be. So it's not, so if I'm seeing someone and I find out down the road they do have an eating disorder because it didn't come out in the very beginning, and they're seeing a social worker, I will not work with them until they are seeing a social worker. And of course, I'll give them, I would give them like 3 different names of social workers that specialize in eating disorders, because if you specialize in the eating disorder, it can actually do harm to the patient, because if you don't know how to deal with eating disorders, and that happens to social workers too. They see someone a few times, find out they have an eating disorder, and then say, that's not my area of expertise, but I'm going to refer you to this person who does do eating disorders only. It's a whole specialty area. So just know that if someone is seeing just the dietitian, there's something wrong with that picture.
Okay. And, I'm glad that you're saying this, because we always talk about, we call it professional courtesy, and it matters. I have done that while I was en route to the ER with a patient who had an eating disorder, just like I've done for other issues. Somebody that had substance abuse issues. When I'm in the hospital or even en route, I ask the nurse that answers the phone or the radio when we calling in doing our radio report, will you have case management available, because this person, we just resuscitated this person that OD'd on some heroin, or we had a person who was suicidal and they swallowed 40 Tylenol. This person needs some mental help. Even the lady that had the eating disorder, the one young lady who had dry heaves, and I told you about this. She had dry heaves. That's what she called about. So it came out as a GI issue. We get there. She has a bloody tissue in her hand. She's very weak. She was still dry heaving in front of us. And so through my assessment, because I'm a Y paramedic, I'm a WHY paramedic, I want to know what's the pathophysiology, what caused you to have all of this stuff. So I took out my pen light. I'm looking in her mouth. She has all these mouth sores. She has a history of esophageal varices. And I'm thinking either she's alcoholic, has cancer, or she has an eating disorder. Well, the eating disorder was the answer.
Mm-hmm.
I had to think outside the box, but really not, because, again, here's why I talk to other first responders, especially on the medical side of first responders, the EMTs, paramedics, and firefighters, because those individuals are cross-trained. I tell them that you have to know the source, and you have to find the proper resource for what you find, even in a pre-hospital environment. So that young lady who tried to commit suicide, who was raped and had this eating disorder, one of the things that I asked for with the case manager, because when we got to the hospital, the case manager was in the room, social worker was in the room, and I told them what was going on, and I said specifically, I pointed to her, or I turned towards her, and I said, here's what she told me about how she developed this eating disorder. And it was because of the sexual trauma. And from that point, we had maybe another 3-minute conversation. And she thanked me for including her in my report, because she said, I wish more of you. I wish I had more people like you. That's what she said. And I was like, what do you mean? She said, I get a lot of people who need social services, and they don't ask the questions that they should be asking when it comes to including me on it. Because sometimes I hear, well, the first responder only asks what hospital you want to go to when they got on scene or what have you. It was just treated like a number. And for you, you're a clinician just like I am. And so I'm the start of that domino effect. What I put in my report, as you said, you got access to. So when you get this referral, you're looking at the EMS sheet, the narrative that I typed up. And so it's important that documentation be part of that meal plan, that meal preparation that you come up with. I need to be making sure that I'm doing my due diligence to help you, because I'm not going to be with that patient for the post-hospital care. That's where you come into play. So for you, one of my questions is, what do you say to people like myself, first responders in particular, who are going to be encountering these trauma survivors with eating disorders and disordered eating? What would your advice be for someone like that?
Got to look not just listen, but you have to observe for clinical symptoms, just like you did, LP, right? That you looked in the mouth, you saw these things, and from your experience of doing this for so long that it was one of three things, and it happened to be the eating disorder. But my thing is, a lot of people don't want to admit they have eating disorders. So you got her to speak about the eating disorder and admit she had an eating disorder. She could have went into the ER. No one could have asked her. No one would have probably asked her about how she was eating or if she had any body dysmorphia. I guarantee it. They would have just got her better, and then she'd be out again, probably only to return again and again until someone like you. But you got that domino effect going. You got that snowball rolling, right? Like they say, it's like, okay, it's getting bigger and now everybody's involved. And instead of wasting all that time, you got the trigger going, right? You triggered it actually to like come out, not in a bad way, in a good way. You got that person to say and admit out loud that yes, they do have an eating disorder. You don't know how long that they went without saying that, even admitting it. So that's huge. It's no different than people that are alcoholics or drug addicts or what have you, right? Like a lot of times they don't want to admit it until it gets till they hit rock bottom or something, and then they have no choice. But that the fact that you were aware of that and the prevalence of eating disorders are so high, I feel like that should be part of the training for emergency medical people like yourself, because it is more common than I think people think.
I got two more questions for you before we wrap up. And I'm going to pull up, that's why I always tell people, you got to watch these interviews, folks, because we're streaming on all major platforms, but you can also watch these interviews on Spotify as well as our YouTube channel, which is Pending Consulting Solutions, LLC. On screen here, for those that don't want to watch, I have up Meg's Linktree as well as her website, which is harmonywithfood.com. And I noticed on both your Linktree and your website, you talk about and you use the word diet. I've heard from Mrs. LP who talks about her issue with disorder eating because she has rheumatoid arthritis and a couple of chronic issues and autoimmune diseases. And that's part of the reason, that's really the reason why I retired from EMS, because during the pandemic, I was treating all these COVID patients. And so I always tell people when they ask me, why are you retired? Because you're such a great, first responder. I'm like, it's because of the danger that it placed in her world. Right. And so I can always get another job. I don't want to get another wife. That's a whole other conversation. But it's part of the conversation. So that's why I retired, folks. Diet. Why do you use the word diet? Because most people that I've talked to say diet is a bad word.
Well, actually, it only is because we've made it a bad word. It actually is, the definition of diet is, I'm not going to say it exact, I'm sure, out of the dictionary, but it's just the foods that you consume. So I don't have a negative connotation towards that word. And I think we need to learn what it really means. And it doesn't mean restricting your food. It doesn't mean going on a diet. And it really means the foods that we're consuming. And instead of putting that word in a bad light, I think it needs to be reintroduced to what it actually is and not have a bad connotation. Because I don't know about you, but I love eating food. I love
eating food.
And so
go down after this interview, Meg.
Food is part of life, and it's one of the positive things in life. So let's not think of that. Let's redefine that word to what it really is. It's the foods that we consume. But what do most people think when they hear the word diet? They think of Jenny Craig. They think of this diet. They think of that diet. They think of deprivational dieting, and they hate it. But really, food should be enjoyed. And so hence the name of my business, Harmony with Food, because we need to stop thinking of the foods we consume as something bad, because it really is something good and it can bring joy to our lives.
I love your philosophy. It says a non-diet, quote unquote, functional nutritional approach, a realistic approach to nutrition. I work on treating the symptoms first. That's why I got you on here, because we're talking about I always say you got to go to the source. Again, I'm a Y paramedic, a WHY paramedic. I want to know the pathophysiology on why you're having whatever medical or trauma symptom that you're having, issue, I should say. This allows you, I'm continuing to read from your website, this allows you to obtain the energy you need to start making some real lifestyle changes. It's impossible to exercise when you have GI issues, headaches, fatigue, etc. As a functional nutritionist, I dig deeper to get to the root cause of the problem. And this is what we're talking about, folks. This is why I got Meg on the Trigger Warning Talk podcast, because we're talking about some of these root causes. It could be trafficking. It can be domestic violence. It could be a sexual-based offense. We want to talk about these things because if you don't know the source, you're not going to get to a resolution.
Hey,
also,
LP, I hate to interrupt you, but I have a call at 11. I didn't realize it was 10 after.
Okay. So I got all your information on the screen. I'm going to post your link tree and your website in the show notes. I want to thank you so much for your time. And what parting words do you have?
What was that?
What are your parting thoughts?
Yeah, just, if you feel like you're having some kind of eating disorder or disordered eating, get the help you need from a team. And a team of people that have specialized in eating disorders, not just any social worker or dietitian or psychiatrist.
As Meg O'Rourke, registered dietitian, folks, we're going to have her information in the show notes. I want to thank you, Meg, for joining us on the Trigger Warning Talk podcast, and I will be talking to you later.
Okay, thank you so much.
Peace and blessings. All right, folks, so that was Meg O'Rourke, registered dietitian, and we're going to jump right over to our missing person case. I want to bring up this young man's information back on the screen here because he's been missing for a cool minute, folks. He's been missing since 2009, and I got this from the Charlie Project, so let me pull it up here on the screen. This young man, his name is Adrian Anderson. Adrian, Adrian Anderson. He's been missing since July 29th, 2009, missing from Newark, Delaware, right here on the East Coast. Classified as missing, sex male, race black, 39 years of age, height and weight at the time missing, 6 foot, 175 pounds, distinguishing characteristics, African American male, black hair, brown eyes. Anderson may have spelled his name Adrienne, which is commonly spelled Adrian for a female. He has tats on his right hand and his abdomen, a tat of a cross with a banner on his right bicep. And if you're watching this podcast, you can see the picture of the tat on his arm and on his abdomen, or excuse me, on his hand and his abdomen. Also, again, he has a tat of a cross with the banner on his right bicep and a tat of a word on his left forearm. Photos of the two tattoos are posted with this case summary. And they only got a few short notes. Anderson was seen in Newark, Delaware on July 29, 2009. He has never been heard from again. He may have traveled to West Virginia. Few details are available in this case. If you have any information about the whereabouts, good, bad, ugly, or indifferent in reference to Mr. Anderson, contact the Newcastle County Police Department at 302-395-8171. Again, if you have any information about Adrian Anderson, who's been missing since 2009 from Newark, Delaware, and if that information is good, bad, ugly, or indifferent, whether he's alive or deceased or in trouble, contact the Newcastle County Police Department, 302-395-8171. And also there's a link to his information on the website NAMUS, NAMUS. I will post the link to Mr. Anderson's story from the Charlie Project in the show notes, along with our guest today, registered dietitian Meg O'Rourke, who is such a wonderful individual. We didn't even get into some of the other stuff because we just didn't have time. And that's okay. We'll have her come back at a later time to jump in on some more specifics about the work that she does with people who have been traumatized under the banners of the conversations that we have: trafficking, domestic violence, true crime, as well as sexual-based offenses. That's it, folks. So again, take a CPR first aid AD course, Stop the Bleed, because we live in real times and it's not a matter of if but when an emergency is going to happen. And you want to be an immediate responder to someone like me, who's the first responder, shows up and can take over patient care. Stuff happens all the time everywhere, folks. And we want you to be prepared. We want you to know that EMS and first responders may be called, may be en route, but because of the danger, they may not be able to get at you, get access to you because of that immediate threat that's going on, whether it's an active violent incident or even something like a fire. Just depends on what the danger is. So that being said, take care of yourself, seek help. I always say mental health crisis is the world's oldest continuous pandemic that's been around since the beginning of mankind, and it's not going anywhere. And until we deal with the stigmas, taboos, and stereotypes, and that's why we do the Trigger Warning Talk podcast, LP out.